The Boeing 777 shuddered violently at 37,000 feet, throwing passengers against their seatbelts as the cabin lights flickered like dying stars. In seat 10A, Major Evangeline Ghost Thorne didn't even open her eyes. She'd felt worse turbulence in a Black Hawk over Kandahar, where Taliban rockets painted orange streaks across the desert sky. Her weathered hands remained folded across the dog-eared copy of Yeager's autobiography in her lap, fingers bearing the subtle scars of 1,000 pre-flight checks. But this wasn't turbulence. Captain Morrison's voice crackled through the intercom, professionally calm yet carrying an undertone that made seasoned travelers sit straighter. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some minor technical difficulties. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The words were standard protocol, but Ghost's trained ear caught the micro-hesitation before minor and the slight tension in his vocal cords. 22 years of military aviation had taught her to read fear in voices, even when they tried to hide it. 3 rows behind her, tech billionaire Marcus Webb clutched his armrest, his knuckles white as printer paper. The man who'd revolutionized autonomous flight systems, who'd spoken at TED Talks about the obsolescence of human pilots, now found himself wishing desperately for human hands on the controls. His company's stock price meant nothing at altitude when hydraulics failed and backup systems started screaming warnings in mechanical voices that sounded like death sentences. Ghost finally opened her eyes as the aircraft lurched again, this time with a grinding sound that passengers mistook for landing gear adjustment, but she recognized as something far worse. Through the small oval window, she could see the wings' slight but unmistakable droop, a telltale sign of control surface failure that meant they had minutes, not hours, before physics reclaimed what engineering had temporarily borrowed. The flight attendant stumbled down the aisle, her professional smile cracking like old paint, as she whispered urgently into her handheld radio. Ghost caught fragments, complete hydraulic failure, and manual reversion only. Words that meant Captain Morrison and his first officer were about to attempt the aeronautical equivalent of performing surgery with boxing gloves, trying to land a machine that no longer wanted to obey the fundamental bargains of flight. The aircraft banked unexpectedly, sending carry-on bags tumbling from overhead compartments like mechanical rain. Someone screamed. A child began crying. And in seat 10A, Major Evangeline Thorne closed her book, unbuckled her seatbelt, and prepared to break about 17 federal regulations to save 243 lives, including the billionaire who'd spent 3 years publicly arguing that pilots like her were relics of an analog age. Tower United 447, declaring emergency. Morrison's voice filtered through the cabin speakers, the words carrying the weight of prayers spoken in aluminum cathedrals, 37,000 feet above the indifferent earth. Captain Morrison's hands trembled as he fought the unresponsive controls, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cockpit's regulated temperature. 28 years of commercial aviation, and he'd never felt an aircraft this determined to return to Earth in pieces. The primary hydraulic system had failed catastrophically somewhere over Kansas, taking with it the power steering that made the Boeing 777 manageable. Now the aircraft flew like a wounded elephant, requiring both pilots to wrestle the controls just to maintain altitude. "Sir," First Officer Yamamoto said, her voice steady despite the circumstances, "backup hydraulics are showing intermittent pressure. We're losing authority on the elevators." She didn't need to explain what that meant. Without elevator control, they'd be unable to maintain level flight, unable to flare for landing, unable to do anything but ride the aircraft into whatever waited below. Behind them, through the reinforced cockpit door, they could hear the flight attendants trying to maintain order as passengers sensed something beyond routine mechanical difficulty. Morrison had flown through thunderstorms that turned day to night and turbulence that tested the structural limits of aircraft engineering, but nothing compared to the helplessness of commanding a machine that no longer acknowledged his authority. United 447, Kansas City Center. The air traffic controller's voice crackled through their headsets. We have you on radar. State your intentions. The question hung in the air like incense in an empty cathedral. Intentions, as if they had any beyond surviving the next 10 minutes. Kansas City, we've lost primary hydraulics and backup is failing, Morrison replied, fighting to keep his voice professional. We need vectors to the nearest suitable airport and emergency equipment standing by. The words felt hollow. Emergency equipment couldn't repair hydraulic failure at altitude. Fire trucks couldn't restore control authority to an aircraft that had forgotten how to be graceful. In the main cabin, Ghost rose from her seat despite the steep bank angle and began moving forward. Other passengers assumed she was heading to the lavatory, but her movements carried the purposeful precision of someone who'd walked through military transport aircraft in combat zones. She paused at row 3, where Marcus Webb sat white-knuckled and wide-eyed, staring out his window at the wing that no longer responded to pilot commands with mechanical obedience. "Excuse me," she said quietly, her voice carrying an authority that made him look up immediately. "I couldn't help but notice you seemed nervous about flying." It was a gentle provocation, delivered with the faintest smile that suggested she knew exactly who he was and what he'd said about pilots becoming obsolete. Webb studied her face, nodding the calm confidence in her green eyes, the way she stood balanced despite the aircraft's erratic movements. "Do you know what's happening up there?" he asked, nodding toward the cockpit. Ghost glanced toward the front of the aircraft, where the flight attendant was still whispering urgently into her radio, then back to Webb. "I know that Captain Morrison is probably discovering that all the computer assistance in the world doesn't matter when the basic systems fail," she said. "I know that right now he needs something that can't be programmed or automated." She paused, letting the words settle. "He needs experience." The aircraft shuddered again, and somewhere in the cargo hold, something metallic groaned in protest. "Ma'am, please return to your seat," called the flight attendant. But Ghost was already moving forward, her military bearing cutting through the civilian chaos like a blade through silk. Morrison felt the aircraft begin to descend despite his efforts to maintain altitude. The manual reversion system required physical strength that commercial pilots rarely needed to develop, and his arms already burned with the effort of holding the control yoke steady. Through the windscreen, he could see the Kansas landscape spreading below them like a patchwork quilt, peaceful and indifferent to their struggle against gravity and mechanical failure. "Sir," Yamamoto said, her voice tight with concentration, "I'm reading total hydraulic failure, manual reversion only." The words carried finality, like a doctor announcing the time of death. Without hydraulics, the aircraft's massive control surfaces became dead weight, responsive only to the tremendous physical effort required to overcome aerodynamic forces that had never been meant for human muscle power alone. Behind them came a sharp knock on the cockpit door, 3 quick raps followed by 2 longer ones, a pattern that made Morrison frown. That wasn't the standard flight attendant signal. That was something else, something that carried military precision in its rhythm. "Captain Morrison," came a woman's voice through the door, clear and authoritative despite the aircraft's groaning protests. "My name is Major Evangeline Thorne. I need to speak with you immediately." Morrison exchanged glances with Yamamoto. Protocol demanded they not open the cockpit door during an emergency, but protocol had already been shattered along with their hydraulic systems. "Flight attendant," he called on the intercom. "Who is that passenger?" The reply came after a moment's delay. "Sir, she says she's a military pilot. Air Force, she seems to know what she's talking about." Through the door, Ghost's voice carried again, calmer now but with an underlying urgency that spoke of experience with life-and-death decisions. "Captain, I've flown aircraft in manual reversion. I know you're fighting the controls right now, but there are techniques that can help. Things they don't teach in commercial aviation because you're not supposed to need them." Morrison felt the aircraft lurch again as his strength wavered. His shoulders screamed with the effort of maintaining control, and they still had thousands of feet to descend before attempting what would either be a landing or a controlled crash. The choice between protocol and survival suddenly seemed academic. "Let her in," he said. The cockpit door opened, and Ghost stepped through with the fluid economy of movement that marked career aviators. She took in the scene instantly: Morrison's white knuckles on the yoke, Yamamoto's focused concentration on the engine instruments, the red warning lights that painted the cockpit in the color of emergency. This was familiar territory, just with different stakes than the combat zones where she'd learned her trade. "Major Thorne," Morrison said without taking his eyes off the instruments, "I don't know what you think you can do, but—" "Captain," she interrupted gently, "with respect, I've landed aircraft with worse damage in places where the runway was optional." She moved behind the pilot seats, her presence immediately changing the cockpit's dynamic. "What's your experience with manual reversion?" Morrison's jaw tightened. "Simulator training only." Ghost nodded, unsurprised. Commercial aviation had evolved beyond the need for such primitive flying skills, until moments like these when evolution revealed its limitations. "The key is to stop fighting the aircraft," she said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd wrestled with death at altitude before. "You're trying to fly it like it still has power assistance. That's why you're exhausted." She placed her hands lightly on Morrison's shoulders, feeling the tension in his muscles, the desperate strain of a pilot at war with physics. "Let the aircraft tell you what it wants to do, then make small corrections. Use the trim tabs, they're still manual. Think of it like sailing in a storm instead of driving on a highway." Morrison tried to process her words while fighting the control yoke that seemed determined to tear itself from his hands. "Easy for you to say," he muttered through gritted teeth. "Actually," Ghost said, her voice carrying a slight edge, "it's not, but easy isn't the same as impossible." She stepped back slightly, giving him space but remaining close enough to intervene if necessary. "Captain, how much fuel remaining?" 43 minutes, Yamamoto answered, her voice steady despite the circumstances. Ghost calculated quickly, her mind running through approach speeds and descent rates, factoring in the additional challenge of manual control. "Plenty of time if we do this right. Captain, I need you to trust me. Let me talk you through the approach." Morrison felt another surge of turbulence test his grip on the controls. Outside, the Kansas landscape continued its slow approach, fields and farms growing larger with each passing moment. Behind them, through the open cockpit door, he could hear passengers praying in languages he didn't recognize, their voices joining in a chorus of hope that rose above the mechanical protests of an aircraft learning to die gracefully. "All right, Major," he said finally, "talk me through it." Ghost moved to the jump seat behind the pilots, her presence somehow making the cramped cockpit feel more spacious rather than crowded. She'd learned years ago that authority came not from taking control, but from helping others discover capabilities they didn't know they possessed. In the military, they called it force multiplication, making everyone around you better at their job. "First, trim nose heavy," she said, her voice calm and instructional. "I know it feels wrong, but trust the physics. Let the aircraft want to descend, then control the rate with gentle elevator inputs." She watched Morrison's hands as he reluctantly adjusted the trim wheel, saw his surprise when the control pressure decreased slightly. "Good," she continued. "Now, Yamamoto, what's your approach speed going to be?" The first officer consulted her quick reference handbook, but Ghost was already speaking. "Forget the book speeds. We're going to be high and heavy, plan for 140 on final, minimum. You'll need the energy to compensate for reduced control authority." Outside, Kansas City approach began vectoring them toward the longest runway available, emergency vehicles already rolling into position. Ghost could picture the scene on the ground: firefighters checking their equipment, ambulances standing by, airport operations cleared and waiting for either triumph or tragedy to unfold from the sky. United 447, Kansas City approach, the radio crackled. Runway 1 left is available, 11,000 feet. Wind is calm. Emergency equipment is standing by. Morrison keyed the microphone with one hand while maintaining pressure on the yoke with the other. Kansas City, United 447. Be advised we have a passenger with military aviation experience assisting with the approach. He paused, then added with unexpected humor, "She seems to know what she's talking about." Ghost smiled despite the circumstances. "Captain, start your descent now. Use power to control rate of descent. The engines are your primary flight controls now. Think of the elevators as fine-tuning devices, not primary controls." The Boeing began its descent toward Kansas City International, no longer fighting the sky but negotiating with it, finding a compromise between mechanical failure and aerodynamic reality. Through the windscreen, the airport grew larger, runway lights beginning to twinkle in the late afternoon sun like terrestrial stars arranged in perfect lines. "Ma'am," Yamamoto said quietly, "what's your background?" Ghost kept her eyes on the approaching runway, calculating angles and distances with practiced precision. 22 years Air Force. C-130s mostly, but I've flown everything from trainers to heavy transports. Some places where the approach charts were classified and the runway conditions were negotiable. Morrison felt the aircraft responding differently now, less like a battle and more like a conversation between pilot and machine. The manual reversion still required tremendous physical effort, but Ghost's guidance had turned brute force into technique, making the impossible merely difficult. 2,000 feet on glide path, Yamamoto called out. The ground rushed up to meet them, Kansas farmland giving way to suburban sprawl, then airport perimeter. Ghost could see the emergency vehicles lined up along the runway like toys, their red and blue lights flashing against the concrete in preparation for whatever outcome physics would deliver. Kansas City International's longest runway stretched ahead of them like a concrete prayer, 11,000 feet of hope, engineered to catch aircraft that had forgotten how to fly gracefully. Ghost watched Morrison's hands on the controls, noting the subtle changes in his technique as he internalized her guidance. He was learning to trust the aircraft's inherent stability instead of fighting it, working with aerodynamic forces rather than against them. 1,000 feet, Yamamoto called out, her voice steady despite the gravity of their situation. Speed 145 on glide path. Ghost leaned forward slightly, her eyes tracking the runway approach lighting system that painted their descent path in white and red. "Captain, remember, normal touchdown, then maximum braking. Don't try to grease this landing. We need to get down and stay down." Through the windscreen, the runway threshold approached with deceptive speed. Morrison felt sweat running down his back despite the cockpit's controlled temperature, his muscles aching from the sustained effort of manual control. But for the first time since the hydraulic failure, he felt like they might actually make it. 500 feet, Yamamoto announced. Localizer and glide slope centered. "Good," Ghost said quietly. "Now, Captain, small flare inputs only. The aircraft wants to land, let it." The Boeing descended through the last few hundred feet of controlled flight, crossing the runway threshold at precisely the right altitude and airspeed. Morrison pulled back gently on the yoke, feeling the aircraft respond sluggishly, but sufficiently to arrest its descent rate. The main landing gear touched down with a solid thump that sent cheers through the passenger cabin, followed immediately by Morrison's firm application of reverse thrust and maximum braking. "United 447, welcome to Kansas City," came the controller's voice, barely containing emotion. "Beautiful job, crew." The aircraft rolled down the runway, shedding speed gradually as emergency vehicles paced them on either side. Through the cabin windows, passengers could see firefighters and paramedics watching their progress, ready for whatever medical attention might be needed, but hoping they wouldn't be necessary. "Full stop," Morrison announced as the Boeing finally came to rest about halfway down the runway. For the first time in 43 minutes, the aircraft sat motionless, its mechanical protests finally quiet. The only sounds were the engines spinning down and the distant wail of sirens as ground crews approached. Ghost unbuckled from the jump seat and prepared to return to the cabin, but Morrison caught her arm. "Major," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and gratitude, "I don't know how to thank you." "No need," she replied, though her eyes showed the satisfaction of another successful landing, added to a career of bringing aircraft and crews home safely. "Just remember this the next time someone tells you pilots aren't necessary." Behind them, the cockpit door opened to reveal Marcus Webb, who had somehow convinced the flight attendants to let him forward. His face was pale, but his eyes were sharp with the intelligence that had built a technology empire. "Major Thorne," he said quietly, "I believe we need to talk." Ghost looked at him for a long moment, recognizing the tone of someone whose fundamental assumptions about the world had just been challenged by reality at 37,000 feet. The passenger cabin erupted in applause as Ghost made her way back through the aisle, but the sound felt distant and surreal after the focused intensity of the cockpit. Flight attendants were already preparing for evacuation procedures, though the successful landing meant they could take their time ensuring passenger safety rather than rushing through emergency slides. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Morrison's voice came over the intercom, "we've landed safely at Kansas City International. Emergency crews will be boarding shortly to conduct standard safety checks, after which we'll proceed to the gate." He paused, then added with unmistakable gratitude, "I'd also like to acknowledge the assistance of Major Evangeline Thorne, whose aviation expertise was instrumental in our safe arrival." The applause intensified, but Ghost barely noticed. She was already focused on the debrief that would follow, the investigation that would examine every decision made during the emergency, the questions about protocol violations that would need answering. She'd broken federal regulations by entering the cockpit and providing assistance without authorization, actions that could result in serious consequences despite the successful outcome. Marcus Webb followed her back to row 10, his expensive suit wrinkled and his carefully styled hair disheveled. "Major," he said as they reached her seat, "I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually." Ghost settled into 10A and picked up her dog-eared copy of Yeager's autobiography, nodding that her bookmark had fallen out somewhere during the emergency. "Mr. Webb, isn't it?" she said without looking up from the book. "I've read some of your statements about autonomous aviation. Interesting theories." Webb winced at her diplomatic understatement. "Theories that don't account for scenarios like what just happened," he admitted. "My company has invested billions in technology designed to eliminate human error in aviation, but we never considered what happens when the technology itself fails." "Technology always fails eventually," Ghost said, finally looking at him directly. "The question is whether you have people who know how to succeed when it does." She glanced toward the cockpit, where Morrison and Yamamoto were undoubtedly running through post-landing checklists with the thoroughness of aviators who had just cheated death through skill and cooperation. Webb sat down in the empty seat beside her, ignoring the concerned looks from other passengers. "Major, I'd like to offer you a job, Chief of Flight Operations for Webb Technologies. Full authority over our aviation division's approach to human factors and pilot training." Ghost raised an eyebrow. "Interesting timing for that offer, Mr. Webb." "The timing is exactly why I'm making it," he replied. "An hour ago, I thought pilots were expensive anachronisms. Now I understand their insurance policies for when the impossible becomes inevitable." Through the aircraft windows, emergency vehicles continued their careful inspection of the Boeing's exterior, checking for structural damage that might have resulted from the hard landing. Ground crews prepared air stairs for passenger deplaning, while investigators began the preliminary work of determining exactly what had caused the hydraulic failure and how it had been overcome. Ghost considered Webb's offer while watching the controlled chaos of post-emergency procedures outside. She'd spent 22 years serving her country in uniform, but retirement meant finding new ways to use skills that had been honed in war zones and tested in peacetime training missions that sometimes turned out to be more challenging than combat itself. "Mr. Webb," she said finally, "I'll consider your offer, but on one condition." "Name it." "Every pilot in your company learns manual reversion techniques. Every single one. Because the next time something like this happens, there might not be a major in seat 10A to talk them through it." Webb extended his hand, recognizing the terms of a bargain that would reshape how his company approached the relationship between human skill and technological capability. "Deal, Major. When can you start?" Ghost shook his hand, her grip carrying the firm confidence of someone who had just demonstrated the irreplaceable value of human expertise in an age increasingly dominated by algorithmic solutions. "Let me finish this book first," she said, holding up Yeager's autobiography. "I'm at the part where he breaks the sound barrier." Outside, Kansas City International Airport continued its normal operations around the emergency response, aircraft taking off and landing with routine precision, while investigators began the painstaking work of understanding how United Flight 447 had been saved by the combination of skilled pilots, manual flying techniques, and a passenger who had learned to wrestle with the sky in places where failure meant more than missed connections and inconvenienced travelers. The evacuation proceeded with unusual calm, passengers filing through the aircraft doors with the subdued awareness of having witnessed something extraordinary. Many stopped to thank Ghost as they passed row 10, though she deflected their gratitude with the quiet professionalism that had characterized her entire military career. She understood that what had happened wasn't heroism in the traditional sense. It was simply the application of skills learned through years of training and experience to a situation that demanded nothing less than perfection. Captain Morrison emerged from the cockpit looking exhausted but relieved, his uniform shirt dark with perspiration from the sustained physical effort of manual control. He paused at Ghost's seat, his expression carrying the complex emotions of a pilot who had just been reminded of his profession's fundamental challenge and reward. "Major," he said quietly, "I've been flying commercially for 28 years, and I've never felt an aircraft fight me the way that 777 did today. Without your guidance—" He left the sentence unfinished, but his meaning was clear. Ghost stood and shook his hand with the respect that one professional aviator offers another. "Captain, you did the flying. I just reminded you of techniques you already knew but had never needed to use. That's the difference between simulation training and experience. Simulation teaches you procedures, but experience teaches you adaptation." Morrison nodded, understanding the distinction. "The investigation team will want to interview you about the assistance you provided. There will be questions about protocol violations, unauthorized cockpit access, that sort of thing." "I understand," Ghost replied. "I've been through investigations before. The important thing is that everyone walked away from this one." Behind them, Webb was gathering his belongings and speaking quietly into his phone, already beginning the process of reshaping his company's approach to aviation technology. The conversation he'd overheard between Ghost and Morrison was providing him with insights that no amount of market research or competitive analysis could have delivered. As the last passengers deplaned, Ghost found herself alone with the flight crew in the now quiet cabin. Through the windows, she could see investigators photographing the aircraft's exterior, documenting the evidence of their successful emergency landing for the reports that would follow. The Boeing 777 sat motionless on the taxiway, no longer the graceful machine that had carried them across the country, but now a case study in the limits of automation and the enduring necessity of human skill. "Major Thorne," First Officer Yamamoto said as she prepared to leave the aircraft, May I ask you something? Ghost nodded, gathering her own belongings with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to rapid deployments and uncertain schedules. How do you stay so calm in situations like that? I mean, you weren't even supposed to be in the cockpit, but you acted like emergency landings were routine. Ghost considered the question while looking around the cabin that had been filled with fear and uncertainty an hour earlier. Yamamoto, fear is information. It tells you when something matters. The trick is not to eliminate fear, but to use it as fuel for focus rather than panic. She paused, then added with a slight smile, besides, after you've landed a C-130 on a dirt strip in Afghanistan while taking small arms fire, everything else feels like a training exercise. They walked together toward the aircraft door, their footsteps echoing in the empty cabin that had recently contained nearly 250 people, whose lives had hung in the balance of hydraulic pressure and pilot skill. 6 months after United Flight 447, Major Evangeline Ghost Thorne stood in the boardroom of Webb Technologies, addressing a group of aviation executives who had gathered to hear about the company's revolutionary new approach to pilot training. The walls were lined with monitors displaying aircraft schematics and flight simulation data, but the focus of the presentation was decidedly human. "Gentlemen, ladies," Ghost began, her voice carrying the same calm authority that had filled the Boeing's cockpit during those critical minutes over Kansas. "We've spent the last decade convincing ourselves that technology could replace human judgment in aviation. Flight 447 proved that assumption was not only wrong, but potentially catastrophic." The executives leaned forward, their attention focused on the woman who had become something of a legend in aviation circles. The story of the emergency landing had been featured in documentary films and aviation safety publications, but more importantly, it had fundamentally changed how the industry approached the relationship between automation and human expertise. Marcus Webb stood at the head of the conference table, his demeanor markedly different from the nervous passenger, who had clutched his armrest 37,000 feet above Kansas farmland. "Major Thorne has implemented what we're calling the Ghost Protocol, comprehensive manual flight training for every pilot in our fleet, regardless of their experience level with modern automated systems." Ghost advanced to the next slide, showing video footage of pilots training in flight simulators programmed with the same hydraulic failure scenario that had nearly brought down United 447. "What we discovered during our training program was that modern pilots are incredibly skilled at managing automated systems, but many had never experienced the physical demands of manual flight control in emergency situations." She clicked to a graph showing dramatic improvements in emergency response times and successful outcomes among pilots who had completed the new training regimen. "The data is clear. Pilots who understand both automated systems and manual flying techniques are exponentially more capable of handling scenarios that fall outside normal operational parameters." One of the executives raised his hand. "Major, what about the cost implications? This level of training requires significant investment in simulator time and instructor resources." Ghost's expression remained neutral, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen the alternative to proper training. "Sir, United Flight 447 was carrying 243 passengers and crew. The aircraft itself was valued at approximately $200 million. The lawsuits that would have resulted from a crash would have cost Webb Technologies' insurance carriers hundreds of millions more." She paused to let the numbers settle. "What's the cost of comprehensive training compared to that?" The room fell silent as the executives processed the economic reality behind her words. Webb stepped forward, his confidence in Ghost's approach evident in his posture and tone. "Since implementing the Ghost Protocol, our pilots have successfully handled 17 emergency situations that previous training methods might not have prepared them for. Equipment failures, severe weather encounters, bird strikes, situations where automation wasn't sufficient and human judgment made the difference." Ghost advanced to the final slide, showing a photograph of the United 777 on the runway at Kansas City International, surrounded by emergency vehicles but intact and upright. "This is what success looks like in our industry," she said quietly. "Not perfect flights where nothing goes wrong, but imperfect flights where everything goes wrong and people still go home to their families." She closed the presentation and looked around the conference table at faces that represented airlines, manufacturers, and training organizations from around the world. Questions. An executive from a major European carrier spoke first. "Major Thorne, how do we convince pilots who have been flying automated aircraft for decades that they need to learn what they consider obsolete skills?" Ghost smiled, the expression carrying both understanding and determination. "You don't convince them," she said. "You show them. Every pilot who goes through our program spends 4 hours in a simulator with multiple system failures and manual reversion required. By the end of that session, they understand why these skills matter." Another voice from the back of the room. "What about regulatory approval for this training methodology?" "The FAA has already approved the Ghost protocol as an acceptable alternative to traditional recurrent training," Webb replied. "In fact, they're considering making similar training mandatory for commercial pilots within the next 3 years." Ghost gathered her materials as the meeting concluded, noting the animated discussions breaking out among the executives. The aviation industry was notoriously conservative, slow to change and resistant to innovations that challenged established practices. But the undeniable success of the new training program was creating momentum for broader adoption across the commercial aviation sector. As the executives filed out, many stopping to shake Ghost's hand and exchange business cards, Webb approached with 2 cups of coffee and the satisfied expression of an entrepreneur whose vision had been validated by measurable results. "6 months ago, I thought technology was the answer to every problem in aviation," he said, handing her one of the cups. "Now I understand that technology is only as good as the humans who use it when everything goes wrong." Ghost accepted the coffee and looked out the conference room's floor-to-ceiling windows at the airfield beyond, where Webb Technologies' fleet of aircraft sat ready for the next training session. "Marcus, technology isn't the enemy. Over-reliance on technology is. The goal isn't to eliminate automation. It's to make sure pilots can succeed with or without it." "Speaking of which," Webb said, "we've had inquiries from military aviation units about adapting the Ghost protocol for combat situations. Apparently, some of our techniques are applicable to scenarios that go beyond hydraulic failure." Ghost raised an eyebrow with interest. She'd left active duty to join Webb Technologies, but her heart remained connected to the military aviation community that had shaped her professional identity. "What kind of inquiries?" "Special operations units, primarily. They're interested in training that prepares pilots for situations where GPS is jammed, communications are down, and aircraft systems are compromised by enemy action. Scenarios where pilots need to rely on fundamental flying skills rather than technological assistance." The conversation was interrupted by Ghost's phone buzzing with an urgent message. She glanced at the screen and felt a familiar tightening in her stomach, the same physiological response that had preceded countless military missions, where the stakes were measured in lives rather than quarterly earnings reports. "Marcus, I need to take this call," she said, already moving toward the conference room door. "It's from MacDill Air Force Base." Webb watched her leave, recognizing the sudden shift in her demeanor from corporate executive to military officer. Whatever was happening, it was significant enough to cut through the professional composure that had made her such an effective advocate for aviation safety reform. Ghost found a quiet corridor and answered the call, her voice automatically shifting to the formal tone she'd used during her years in uniform. "Major Thorne." "Ghost, it's Colonel Martinez. I need you back." The words carried implications that went far beyond a simple request for consultation. Martinez had been Ghost's commanding officer during her final assignment, a woman whose judgment had been tested in combat zones across 3 continents. If she was calling personally rather than going through official channels, the situation was either highly classified or desperately urgent. "Sir, I'm no longer active duty," Ghost replied, though her pulse had already quickened with the familiar anticipation of operational deployment. "I know, but we have a situation developing that requires your specific skill set. A civilian airliner has been hijacked over the Pacific. Standard response protocols aren't applicable because the hijackers have disabled all automated flight systems and are demanding manual control of the aircraft." Ghost felt the world narrow to a single point of focus, the way it always did when abstract training scenarios became life-and-death realities. "How many passengers?" 312, including a congressional delegation returning from trade negotiations in Japan. Martinez paused, and Ghost could hear the weight of command in the silence. "Ghost, the hijackers are demanding that all rescue attempts use manual flight techniques only. No GPS, no automated navigation systems, no fly-by-wire controls. They've somehow disabled the aircraft's automation and are claiming they'll crash it if any rescue aircraft approach using modern avionics." The tactical implications began cascading through Ghost's mind with the systematic precision that had made her one of the Air Force's most effective special operations pilots. "They want to level the playing field," she said. "Force everyone involved to rely on basic flying skills instead of technological advantages." "Exactly. And Ghost, there's something else. The lead hijacker has been identified. His name is Viktor Petrov, former Russian military pilot who was dismissed from service for philosophical differences with automated flight systems. Intelligence suggests he specifically requested this scenario as a way to prove that human pilots are superior to technological solutions." Ghost understood immediately. This wasn't just a hijacking. It was an ideological statement being made with 300 lives as leverage. Petrov was attempting to prove the same point she'd been making in corporate boardrooms, but through violence rather than training programs. "Colonel, what do you need from me?" "We need you to lead a rescue operation using aircraft configured for manual flight only. No automation, no GPS navigation, no fly-by-wire controls. Pure flying skills against a hostile pilot who's trying to prove the same point you've been making about the importance of manual flight training." The irony wasn't lost on Ghost. She'd spent 6 months advocating for the preservation of manual flying skills, and now those same skills were being weaponized against innocent civilians by someone who shared her fundamental beliefs about aviation, but had chosen a radically different method of expression. "Sir, I'll need complete operational authority and access to aircraft that can be configured for manual flight operations." "Done, Ghost. There's a transport leaving MacDill in 2 hours. Can you be on it?" Ghost looked back toward the conference room where Marcus Webb was undoubtedly fielding questions from aviation executives about training costs and implementation timelines. The corporate world had provided her with a platform to influence aviation safety policy, but her real identity remained rooted in military service and the obligations that came with specialized skills. "Sir, I'll be there." 2 hours later, Ghost sat in the cargo bay of a C-130 transport aircraft climbing through the night sky toward an airbase that officially didn't exist on any public aviation charts. Around her, the specialized equipment and personnel needed for a manual flight rescue operation were secured in the utilitarian efficiency that characterized military operations, where success was measured in lives saved rather than profit margins generated.